December 1763. A settlement called Conestoga, Pennsylvania. There are perhaps 20 people living here. An old man. A handful of women. Children. This is what remains of a nation that, a century and a half earlier, English colonist John Smith described, based on accounts relayed to him by the Powhatan Confederacy, as too formidable to approach without an armed escort. A group of colonists calling themselves the Paxton Boys ride in before dawn. By the time they leave, every person in Conestoga is dead. Some of them were living under the direct written protection of the Pennsylvania colonial government. It did not matter. History remembers this as a massacre. It was actually something colder than that. It was a formality. Because the nation these people belonged to, the Susquehannock, had already been dying for 90 years. Disease had gutted them. War had broken them. Their own name had already started disappearing from the documents written about the region they once controlled. The men who rode into Conestoga in December 1763 didn't destroy a powerful people. They finished erasing one that the previous century had already almost erased entirely. This is how that erasure happened, and how a nation that once forced the Iroquois Confederacy to retreat ended up needing 20 lives to finish killing. To understand what was lost at Conestoga, you have to go back more than 150 years, to a river valley the Susquehannock had controlled for roughly 1,000 years by the time any European set foot in it. Archaeological evidence suggests the Susquehannock, an Iroquoian-speaking nation, migrated eastward from the Ohio Valley in earlier centuries and settled along the river that still carries their name. By the time John Smith encountered a group of Susquehannock warriors near the mouth of the Susquehanna River in 1608, they were already, by his account, a formidable and physically imposing people. Smith never met them directly in large numbers himself. His description comes filtered through the Powhatan Confederacy, who knew them as a rival power to the north. That second-hand origin matters, and it is worth saying plainly rather than smoothing over. Much of what we know about the Susquehannock in this earliest period comes from people who feared them, not from the Susquehannock themselves. What is better supported is the scale of what they built. Population estimates for the year 1600 placed the Susquehannock between 5,000 and 7,000 people, organized across several distinct communities along the river valley. Through the middle of the 17th century, they were not a marginal power adapting to European arrival. They were one of the dominant political and military forces in the mid-Atlantic region, and they built that dominance the same way every serious power in the region did, through trade, through war, and through alliance. They positioned themselves as essential intermediaries in the fur trade, moving goods between European colonies and indigenous nations further inland. That position gave them leverage, and they defended it. Around 1666, Susquehannock forces won a notable victory against combined Seneca and Cayuga war parties, a direct military check against the Western Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most powerful indigenous political structures on the continent. In 1652, the Susquehannock formalized an alliance with the English colony of Maryland through the Articles of Peace and Friendship. That treaty reinforced their regional standing, though it came at a cost. It required ceding significant territory along the Chesapeake. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates the story before the story turns dark. The Susquehannock were not passive victims of colonial expansion from the outset. They were sophisticated political actors who used alliance with a European colony to secure their position against indigenous rivals, the same way nations across the continent were doing in this period. For much of the 17th century, that strategy worked. Then, within roughly a single decade, it stopped working entirely. The early 1670s brought a population collapse of a speed and severity that historians still describe in stark terms. Smallpox and other epidemic diseases, introduced through sustained European contact, tore through Susquehannock communities that had no prior exposure and no immunity. That collapse arrived alongside intensifying warfare tied to what historians call the Beaver Wars, the broader, decades-long conflict across the Great Lakes and Mid-Atlantic region as the Iroquois Confederacy and other nations fought to control the fur trade and its supply lines. A nation weakened by disease is a nation that cannot fight a war on the same terms it once could. By 1675, the Susquehannock, reduced and exhausted, suffered decisive defeat at the hands of the Iroquois Confederacy. What happened next was not annihilation. It was dispersal, and dispersal, it turns out, can erase a people almost as completely as violence does, just more quietly. Survivors scattered in several directions. Some fled west through Allegheny Mountain passes into the Ohio country, where they are believed to have been absorbed into Shawnee communities. Others moved north into New York, incorporated into Seneca and Onondaga towns, following the Haudenosaunee's established practice of adopting defeated peoples rather than simply displacing or destroying them, a practice that, depending on how you read it, either preserved Susquehannock lives and lineage inside a new political structure, or dissolved a distinct nation into someone else's identity. Still others remained in the Susquehanna Valley itself, eventually resettling by the 1690s in a village the English came to call Conestoga. This is where the historical record gets genuinely difficult, and it is worth being honest about that difficulty rather than resolving it artificially. Colonial-era record-keeping regarding indigenous populations was inconsistent at best and frequently indifferent. Modern historians working from the surviving documentary and archaeological record, including Barry Kent's extensive archaeological study of the indigenous peoples of the Susquehanna Valley, generally acknowledge that a fully precise account of where every dispersed group ultimately settled, and how thoroughly their distinct identity persisted within the nations that took them in, remains genuinely incomplete. Some individuals and family lines carried Susquehannock ancestry forward inside Shawnee, Seneca, and Onondaga communities for generations. How much of their language, their specific governance, their distinct cultural identity survived that absorption in any recognizable form, against how much was permanently lost in the process, is a question the surviving record cannot answer with confidence. This is a case where the honest position is uncertainty, not a tidy narrative in either direction. By 1700, the remaining Susquehannock population at Conestoga numbered only around 300 people, a catastrophic decline from the thousands recorded barely a century earlier. And the story of that community did not end quietly. In December 1763, a vigilante group of Pennsylvania colonists calling themselves the Paxton Boys, acting amid the regional tensions of Pontiac's War, attacked and murdered the remaining Susquehannock residents of Conestoga. Some of the dead were under the direct protection of colonial authorities at the time they were killed. It made no difference. The attack effectively ended the last continuously identifiable Susquehannock community in the valley that still bears their name. What survives beyond that end point is fragmentary, but it is not nothing. Some historians have traced likely Susquehannock descent among later prominent indigenous figures, including the Oneida leader Shenandoah and the Mingo leader Logan, both active generations after Conestoga's destruction. That should be stated carefully, the way the historians who raised it stated, as a suggestion of genuine, if diffuse, lines of descent persisting within other nations, not as settled fact. It is one of the few threads connecting the Susquehannock name to anything after 1763, and it is a thread, not a rope. So what actually happened to the Susquehannock nation in the century between John Smith's account and the Paxton Boys' raid? Not one single catastrophe. 2. A biological one that no strategy could have outnegotiated, and a political one that followed directly from the first, because a nation gutted by disease cannot hold a river valley against the Iroquois Confederacy the way it could a generation earlier. What followed the defeat of 1675 was not a second massacre. It was something the written record is far less equipped to track, hundreds of individual decisions, made by hundreds of individual survivors, about which community to walk into and which name to answer to afterward. That is the real subject of this episode. Not the massacre at Conestoga, that is simply the moment the slower story became visible enough for colonial clerks to bother writing it down. The real subject is what a nation actually is, and how much of one can disappear from the documentary record while its people are still, technically, alive. The Susquehannock were not erased in 1675, and they were not fully erased in 1763 either. They were erased by degrees, absorbed into other nations' names, so that by the time the Paxton Boys rode into Conestoga before dawn, they were not killing a nation. They were killing the last 20 people still willing, or still able, to answer to a name that had already stopped appearing in most of the documents written about the land it once described. History has a word for what happens to a defeated people. It does not have a word for what happens to a people who are simply absorbed, degree by degree, until the only thing left to destroy is their name, and even that, by 1763, almost nobody was left to remember.